morning, everyone. Thanks for coming along to this session. Today I'm going to be talking about one of the case studies that's embedded across our project in the Improving Indigenous Research Capabilities project. So I'm going to go through a little bit of detail about how it is, first and foremost, about our project that we've been working on in partnership with the ARDC and a multitude of other partners. But I'm also going to talk a bit about the context and complexity of doing digitisation and cataloguing in different contexts across Australia, particularly in this location in Yirrkala in northeast Arnhem Land. So to begin with, I'd also like to acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal people, the traditional owners and their custodianship of the land on which we're meeting today. And I really sincerely would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and the place of Indigenous knowledge in universities and beyond. So just to begin with, want to give you a little, I understand that Jenny Fuster gave you a little bit of context about our project in the Hassandai program, the Improving Indigenous Research Capabilities program. It really has emerged from, I guess, early 2021 when we started designing this project. So the lead of the project is Professor Marcia Langton. I've been working with Professor Langton for about 15 years now. To give you a bit of context about myself, I'm trained as a medical anthropologist. I started off my academic career with my PhD doing completely what you would say different topic areas. As a medical anthropologist, I did research in India looking at medical tourism and health equity impacts of that in big hospitals in Maharashtra and Mumbai specifically. But when I got back from my fieldwork, I started doing a little bit of work with Marcia, specifically around issues to do with alcohol management across the northern jurisdictions of Australia. And to explain to you why I'm talking about this, when we were doing this work, was also around the time where there was starting to be this movement looking at Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance that was emerging across the globe. And we had found repeatedly in our work with communities across Australia, and predominantly at the time we were working up in Cape York, also some of the communities across the Northern Territory and also in the East Kimberley, time and time again we would find issues related to data access within the community controlled sector, but for the communities more broadly themselves. So in terms of, I guess, a lot of that, the work that we were doing there and the ongoing frustration we would have working with these communities who were desperately wanting to access data about themselves, but also to be able to develop data for themselves so that they could ensure that they were able to set up their priorities in the work that they were doing for their communities, with their communities. So I guess the genesis of that, we did hold a symposium back in 2017, bringing together a whole lot of stakeholders from across Australia, from the academic sector, but also from the community-controlled sector, and a range of people and communities who are actually already on the ground doing a lot of work of collecting their own data that was meaningful for themselves in their communities. The genesis of that was the creation of the Indigenous Data Network, which then flowed on. We now have multiple projects, including this big national project with the ARDC. So just to give you a bit of a background, we do work with organisations, the community-controlled sector significantly, particularly in case studies such as the one I'm about to talk to. But also we partner with IATSIS, so government agencies that are concerned, and some of the big data agencies like the Australian Bureau of Statistics and the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, amongst many others. So it's really this work that we're doing, we're wanting it to be a really collaborative effort across a whole range of different sectors who are custodians of Indigenous data, because we recognise that Indigenous data is held everywhere across Australia, which I'm sure that Levi has actually gone into in earlier sessions and in the first day of the summer school, the masterclass. Yeah. So just to give you a little bit of a rundown of the structure of how it's emerged, this particular project that the Yirrkala case study is embedded in, we started with a little less complex format than this, but as you could see from the last slide, there are a range of different people working across different universities and agencies on this. And we wanted to make sure that we were really being quite strategic in putting together a project that was going to address the concerns of data custodians everywhere. One of the key things that we're always really cognizant of within the Indigenous Data Network is that our primary objective is ensuring, first and foremost, that any of the solutions or tools or resources that we create or co-develop with people, first and foremost have communities in mind, which is hence why having case studies with individual community groups all across Australia we find as one of the most important elements of the work, so that it becomes a ground up rather than a top-down approach to the work that we're doing. We do find that in the past there have been so many technical solutions that are not useful for communities, people on the ground who are working in the day-to-day at the coalface. Therefore, we see this as an extraordinarily important factor of the work that we do. So the way we've organised it is we have multiple streams with a foundation stream. Each stream has a series of activities ranging from sort of 2 to 6 activities, which probably really are relatively standalone projects, or could be standalone projects in and of themselves. It is a very large project. We build digital infrastructure, but we're also undergoing a significant amount of research to make sure anything that we produce from this project is going to be useful, as I said, from the communities up, but also across all of the different custodian groups who hold Indigenous data. So the foundation stream really is a series of activities working across all of these groups, ensuring that we are looking at these issues of Indigenous data governance and sovereignty. Because we know it's a core issue that really so many, whether it's a government agency or a tertiary institution or communities, really struggle to get a grasp on how to practically implement these principles and understandings about it in the day-to-day practices that they do in their work. So this foundation stream actually feeds into and informs all the other work of the project. We have some, more technical sides of the project. So we have our Indigenous data catalogue and resources and extensions, which both Levi and one of our colleagues, Nick Carr, who's over here in the audience, will be taking, I think, some of you through during the course over today and tomorrow. And a range of tools and resources that have been developed from that substream as well, that again, we hope are going to be useful for specifically that community base, but also for data custodians across all sectors, which is sort of not a particularly easy thing, which is why we're embedding it within this research around it. We're also doing work on Indigenous spatio-temporal frameworks and infrastructure, which there might be, I think, a summary of some of that work that has been completed already in some of our plans for the future. But there's also really a big focus on data capability across all sectors. So, and also work on Indigenous repositories and data repatriation, which we've been working with different groups across Australia with these big issues of data being housed about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, which either they have no access to, or there is capability issues on the ground where we're working with different communities to try and understand and provide feedback and resources to enable people to be actually think about their data into the future, data ownership, data stewardship, data custodianship. So we're working really closely with a range of different groups across Australia on that as well. Yeah. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit more about the Yirrkala School Literature Production Centre case study. Now this particular case study is quite a complex one. We've embedded activities across the project on this because it is really relevant to all of the work we do. It is by no means the only case study with communities across the project, but it is one of the ones where it applies to a range of different areas and is informing the work of the rest of the project. Now, for those of you who don't actually know where Yirrkala is, I do have a couple of handy maps here, which I have been informed that this particular map isn't the best map, although it does come from the Lenaboy Homelands Corporation. But Yirrkala, as you can see, well, we'll start with the map of Australia. So you can see it's the northern tip of Australia is northeast Arnhem Land. And Yirrkala itself is situated up where that big arrow is up the top. So it is really a very remote community. It is located about 20 kilometres away from Nhulunbuy, which is above it. That is a mining town that has a relatively large population for Arnhem Land itself, but we're talking about small populations. In Yirrkala, when people aren't out in the homelands, the general population sits at around 800 people. However, despite this, they are very, very active in a whole range of issues and historically have been so since the mission was created back in, I think it was 1934. 39, I've got it on the slide. I should read my slide. But to give you a little bit of context about this school and why we are working with the Yirrkala school, you really have to understand the political milieu within which it's situated. So the Yirrkala school itself started off as a mission school back in the early days. However, with the advent of the 1970s bilingual movement that was led by the Whitlam government, it really led to the school's bilingual program coming about. There was a movement across that time, particularly in the Northern Territory, and there were resources put in to, I think it was 24 different schools, to create bilingual programs so that children were able to speak their first languages within the school context. Now, you would think that, well, it actually operated in a very interesting way in Yirrkala. So the lingua franca is Yolŋu Data. There are actually approximately 30 clan dialects that fall under the Yolŋu Data banner. So even just things like trying to determine the specific clan dialect that they were going to teach in the school was quite difficult and really required engagement from the multiple clan groups from around the region to make determinations about languages that they were teaching their children, how it fit into their ceremonial and understandings of themselves and how their children were growing and learning, which I don't have time to get into today and am not the right person to be discussing it. Hopefully at some point, we are writing publications on it with the other lead on this case study, who is Professor Yolŋu Data, who I guess I can give you some context of how we started working in the Yirrkala school. So one of our colleagues at the University of Melbourne had spent probably the last decade working in the Yirrkala school and the Lanapoi homeland schools, bringing University of Melbourne graduate training teachers up to Yirrkala and Northeast Arnhem Land to do 6-week placements in the school. A lot of that has led to significant recruitment from the students who go up there, which has been very useful to the school. There's a very strong and good relationship. We've also sort of developed pathways for the Yolŋu trainee teachers to come down to Melbourne and have placements in Melbourne, which is a program we're developing. So there was this really long history of relationship between the University of Melbourne, our colleague, and the work being undertaken in the school. Now, Professor Yolŋu Data, who was last year's Senior Australian of the Year, she was getting increasingly frustrated. She did actually retire from her role. She was a teacher linguist and worked in the Northern Territory as a trained teacher for a bit, I said 40 years one time. She told me off and said it was much longer than that, at least 45. So she worked in the school system for a very long time and worked tirelessly to ensure that the bilingual programs were maintained and continued on, and also are really strongly governed by leadership of the communities and the clans around them. She's very much a stickler and tells the kids off if they're pronouncing any words incorrectly. I think there's quite a few well-known bands that come out of the region that she gets quite gruff with them when they mispronounce particular words. But she's a very, very strong advocate that to keep their culture strong and alive, that it is absolutely essential that children are taught their first languages in a schoolroom context. However, as I was saying before, that bilingual movement started in the 70s. However, by the late 90s, there was an awful lot of backlash against the bilingual programs, particularly across the Northern Territory. There were claims that they were, over-resourced, that they were inefficient, that children weren't learning as effectively as they could. I would go as far to say that that was all complete nonsense. They were extraordinarily under-resourced, but it was, as we see in so many ways in Indigenous areas of Australia, gets highly politicised, particularly when there are changing governments, and we still see this today. However, it wasn't until, I think it was 2008, that there was a significant shift that threatened to shut down the bilingual programs across the entire Northern Territory. So at this time, I think there was something like 60 schools who had significant bilingual programs that were embedded within their their school systems and programs. However, there was a new policy that was introduced by the Northern Territory Department of Education at the time by the Minister, Marion Scrimgeour, which required all schools to do a minimum of 4 hours of the first 4 hours of their day in English. Now, in many, many ways, this threatened the bilingual programs. And again, I won't go into the complexities of it, but needless to say, within approximately a year, it went from 60 schools with bilingual programs across the territory to only 8, effectively shutting down these programs. Now, however, as a response to this, across 2008 and 2009, there was a Yolŋu-led campaign to attempt, maybe if we flip to the next slide, Levi, to push back on this policy. As you can see, there's one of the protests that occurred, I think that was in 1999, that came from a lot of the drive from the Yirrkala school, pushing back to say, no, this is essential for our children's learning. This is essential for the way that they are going to succeed, thrive, and also retain and maintain their culture. I've popped a little quote up there from Professor Yunupingu, just to give you a little bit of context of how they were feeling at the time. But there was actually a really well-organised campaign across media, across a range of different communities across the territory that really put that pressure back on the territory government, who eventually did relent. But it didn't really undo the damage that had been done. We see today that there are very few bilingual programs across the Northern Territory schools. However, the Yirrkala school is one of the longest running schools who have retained their program. Across that period where the Territory government were trying to shut them down, they essentially ignored the policy advice and continued on. Maybe if we go to the next slide, Levi. So now just to give you that bit more context of, I started telling you about how Yolŋu was working with the University of Melbourne. And she was getting increasingly concerned about the materials they were producing within their Literature Production Centre, which essentially is the way that they put together their resources to teach their bilingual program. The way it works in the school itself, there is usually a fully trained teacher who more often than not is non-Indigenous, and there are local Yolŋu team teachers who work in there. There's a whole other fight that I won't go into again about trying to ensure that the Yolŋu team teachers are actually trained to become the fully qualified teacher, but this is the way that this system has operated for many, many years. However, there are resources required in the languages that they speak and teach within the classrooms, and these are done within the Literature Production Centre. So there are teacher linguists who was Yolŋu for decades, and now there've been a series of others after her. But they produce the material from stories, from a whole range of cultural and traditional, but also do things like The Hungry Caterpillar has been translated into Dwyer. They have an app they developed in a university partnership as well that allows the children to work on iPads with the Yolŋu Mata language and animation. So there's a series of things that they do there. So Yolŋu was increasingly concerned and voiced her concerns to my colleague about a range of researchers coming into the school and essentially taking away their knowledge and using it for themselves without permission, without any notification, without any requests whether they can use that information. We see this everywhere, but Yolŋu was getting increasingly concerned and asked Bern, my colleague, whether she could bring someone up to talk to her about it who has a bit of a knowledge of research ethics, and it is one of the areas that I've specialised in the past decade or so. So she invited me to come up and have a talk to Yolŋu, and in our discussions, she took me through the archive of the Literature Production Centre and started showing me some of the really important material that was in that archive. And as we came to discover over the course of doing this case study in the last couple of years, the work itself that are the resources for the bilingual program are significant in and of themselves, but this archive holds a multitude of really culturally and historically significant material across formats, every possible format I would imagine that you could think of, and very little of it was digitised. There had been several periods across the time that the school had been open where they had done minor cataloguing that was on written pieces of paper. There was a couple. It's a similar story to what you see in a lot of remote and regional and even, well, contexts across Australia of Indigenous data custodians. But what struck us in the first instance was there was a massive amount of material in there, and there was black mould in this archive where it was all sitting, and the material was rapidly degrading. As I mentioned before, schools like Yirrkala, the Yirrkala Bilingual School, and in community control contexts all over Australia is hugely under-resourced to actually do anything to maintain or save these archives, let alone digitise them, let alone catalogue them. So in discussions with Yolŋu, we came up with a plan looking at thinking through Indigenous data governance, or in this instance, Yolŋu Data Governance across the material held within the LPC, but also necessitated digitisation of this really significant archive. So I think you can probably understand a little bit more of the context of the importance of this archive for the Yolŋu people of the region, as articulated best by, by Mirki and Jawandil, people who are working in the school, but also have really senior leadership roles across the community. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the practical issues we've encountered along the way, which we knew that there were going to be some, and anyone who starts working on archives, particularly in really remote regions and in the tropical north end of the country, there are a series of environmental issues that have to be taken into consideration. We did understand that the archive room itself was quite damp and that it was likely to be mould, but it took for the first sort of trip to go up there and really start extensively looking into that, the archive room itself, to understand the extent of the damage of the mould across the entire archive. And as I said before, the variety and range of different resources in there, anything from boxes and boxes of VHS tapes that had recordings of significant ceremonial aspects, but also, school events back in the 80s, through to photos that were very, very old. A lot of people have been using that archive in the school as a place to store material that they knew wasn't going to get thrown out. So, we dug up photos from as early as the 30s. There's a whole lot of material from the Northern Land Council in there, just to name a few different things. Also, the cartographic material, there's a range of different old maps that have never been digitised. There are every form of audio-visual that you can think of, and most of it has some form of mould damage to it. So our immediate concern was getting up there, getting a lot of people on the ground, first understanding that black mould can have serious health implications, not only for us going in there and doing it, but for the people who are working in that environment on a day-to-day basis. So we had to think of sort of very, very pragmatic ways to try and get rid of the mould as best we could to ensure that we were saving as much material as we could. So we came up with a range of...
Can I jump in?
Yeah,
also...
please do.
Hello. I'm not going to lean over like that. That's awkward. Yeah, just to kind of dovetail in and talk about the black mould, for anyone who's got a background in archival or collections management,
And when we talk about Indigenous data governance, right, management absolutely comes within that aspect of it. And so this is one of the actual challenges of, you know, talking about Indigenous data governance, right, and the many different formats in which data, particularly the definitions, you know, as asserted and stipulated both by GIDA, both here at a national level with the Maimnari Wingara Collective, this is all data, and this all comes underneath the governance and management. So, you know, we're not talking about, you know, the nefarious, you know, bad intent of peoples. This is all these other things that are external factors that are, you know, very real threats. But when it comes to black mold, and, you know, it's a pathogen. It's a deadly pathogen, and so there's a very real risk of this stuff being, like, gone forever. And that's actually what necessitated the need for it to be digitised. Other than that, right, there's multiple other pathogens in there. Can you hold your questions until later, please? There's multiple other pathogens in there, including rust and all of those other things. The issue with it is, as a physical asset, even once we've got this digitised, as a physical asset, it is going to be ever increasingly difficult to look at long-term preservation and storage of that. Yeah, I just wanted to jump in.
Thank you. So I won't go into detail of all the different methods that we have come up with to try and both save the material to ensure that it can be housed properly in the long term. You can see here one of the methods that Levi came up with in terms of the black mould, in particularly the books and resources. And also this whole thing of being very difficult to get equipment up there. It's very expensive, you have to get it shipped. There's some stuff that you can get in Nhulunbuy. However, most of the stuff you have to get delivered there. So practically, one of the solutions was to suction in, essentially kitchen suction machine, putting those books into getting the air all suctioned out, taking them out onto the lawn, waiting for them to heat up to 30 degrees, which kills the black mould, and then saving that material and maintaining it in those suction locked after we digitise the best copies. A lot of the resources there are copies, so through a process of negotiation with the school governance and the Yolŋu Action Group, who do a lot of governance within the school, we came up with this particular method for this problem. So we're ensuring that not only we're digitising this material so it can be reproduced later, we're also ensuring that they have these original physical copies that will not get further damage and that the black mould is removed from. So there's a range of different things that we've been trying to do in, as I said, a very, very under-resourced environment, which I think is not uncommon across Australia. I mean, when we first came into the archive, it wasn't just that black mould had accumulated over time, which it had. There was also an issue that over the summer break when the school was shut down, the air conditioner had malfunctioned, there was cyclones and cyclonic weather coming through, and the whole archive flooded. When they came back to the school, there was this much water in the bottom of the archive itself. So these are ongoing issues. We've also had to deal with or do planning and trying to work through issues of, okay, so once it's all digitised and we catalogue it, which is, the cataloguing is another element that we're working through with the leaders within the school because of the complexity of the languages and the governance overlay across the catalogue. But we're working through longer term solutions, partnering with the Muka project, who is also a community control part of the Arts Centre in Yirrkala, to do long-term storage, because we've actually worked with them as another case study on elements. So just tying these elements together, it's very, very complex, and it's really, really time-consuming, and not something that we can set the timelines for. Not just because there are unexpected things that come along and disrupt it, but because there are these real environmental, I guess, issues that arise. And the geographical location of the place makes it quite difficult. Internet access is really pretty problematic and haphazard. Even getting up there on a regular basis, which we do, to run a range of all of this work is co-designed. All of this work is co-delivered. So we work really closely with everyone in the school. We don't do anything without guidance from the Yolŋu Action team, who, as I said, govern the school. So it's a complex project. it is really difficult, but feeds into a lot of the areas that we're really interested in ensuring that there is a solid evidence base to provide a range of tools for people all over Australia to be able to work with in different contexts. And yes, of course, there's also a variety of technical complexities within that, whether it be, again, trying to get the equipment to Yirrkala or thinking through long-term solutions so that once this project is completed, they actually have the means to continue doing this work themselves also. So whether it is, the slides that we are converting or digitising may never need to be digitised again, but ensuring that those technical capabilities are translated across to people who are Yolŋu, who it is their community, and it will be retained there for them. Yeah, keep flipping. There's also a series of Indigenous cultural and intellectual property issues that we are grappling with across the project, which we knew was going to be an issue, and Australia really does not have particularly strong legislative framework to protect ICIP for Indigenous data. There is quite a few legislative elements across, but they're very ad hoc. They do not necessarily provide the protection needed. One of the first things we recognised was going to be a significant issue is that although these materials in the archive held extensive Indigenous knowledge developed and put into this archive by the people of the region, the archive sits within the Yirrkala School, which is the Northern Territory Department of Education school. A lot of the resources were co-developed with non-Indigenous teachers. And as I've said before, with the shifting political sands, whether it's governments coming in and out, their willingness to actually think through issues such as Indigenous data sovereignty in this case can be fluctuating and problematic. So we have had series of meetings with the now former Northern Territory Labor government. We've initiated discussions with the incoming CLP, which have been, I must say, far more problematic and worrying. What we're really aiming to do is to ask the Northern Territory Department of Education to hand over the IP outright to the Yolŋu people of Yirrkala. However, even that in and of itself, because of the Western framework of our legislative system, means that there needs to be an entity or individual to hand that to, and that is not the way that governance operates in this region. So we're working through a range of these issues as well within the project and within this specific case study that's informing the rest of the project. Yeah, so as I said, there's also issues to do with now we're creating digital material, ensuring that that digital material is housed or the ownership of it does not remain with, say, the University of Melbourne or the IDN. It needs to be owned by the Yolŋu people themselves, determined by themselves. Yeah. And as I'm running short of time, and I probably have already touched on this, yeah, another major element of the case study is actually developing with the Yolŋu people or the multiplicity of different groups who are engaged in this project. So as you can see, it's the Yolŋu Action Group of the school, the Dimaru Aboriginal Corporation, who produce a whole range of learning on country materials that they deliver with the school. The Yirrkala Foundation, who are involved in this project as well, and other significant clan leadership and community members, all are involved in this work of creating a framework that is actually going to work for the people of the region. But again, this is complex and it's not something that timelines that we can set. Really all we can do is help facilitate and support people in what it is that they want and how it is going to look, which is going to be similar in different locations across Australia in different contexts. So it's been a very broad brush overview of this particular case study, but as I said, it really is embedded in our broader project in many ways to ensure that we are getting this community up approach to any of the work that we're doing, resources, tooling, the digital infrastructure, is informed from these sorts of local case studies.
Can I, and yeah, I'm cognizant of the time, but also respecting. Yeah, we got 5 minutes? Okay. Yeah.
cognizant of the time and all of that kind of stuff, what we're it is, we decided to try and present this as a case study. We've got multiple case studies in here, and it's, you know, critical for us to kind of communicate that this isn't just, us picking and saying, oh, let's pick, a really remote Aboriginal community, etc. It's also, we've got very long-standing relationships with communities. And I say we, collectively, as the ISU, also as individual academics, researchers, and also just, professional staff members. We all got, we bring a multitude and a wealth of relationships from previous partnerships, but they're all sustained. So, Marcia, as the chief investigator of this project and as a director within the university, Marcia's had ongoing relationships in this community for 40 years. These relationships, if we're talking about data management and, retention and all those kind of stuff, relationships need to last the longevity of that. It's not just within, this short temporal range of a year, 2 years, 3 years. It's for however long, that data exists, we need to kind of maintain those relationships. That is the commitment that needs to be, actualised. The other part of it as well is that, we've got other examples and other communities and case studies that are based in metropolitan, that aren't in just, these remote and extreme examples. But what we had to do and why this got so big is because, and I can't understate this enough, it needs to be evidence-based. It needs research. It needs to be a good cross-section examining all of these different areas and all these different environments in which data exists. It's why we have to interrogate the government. It's why we have to interrogate universities in the academy. It's why we have to work with Aboriginal community control. All of those different types of guardianship and custodians of data, you can't just start to imagine and start to work through Indigenous data governance and sovereignty if you're not looking at this in a very broad and a very earnest way.
Yeah, which is also why we really are strong believers of a truly multidisciplinary approach. It can't just be technical spectrum, it can't just be looking at social, all of these elements need to come together to actually create solutions that are going to work for everyone. So, has anyone got any quick questions before we finish up? Yeah, sure. Pardon? The problem with that, which I didn't get into, is the infrastructure of the building itself. Oh,
Does she, do we do
whether
anything?
we've done anything about getting the mould out of the building itself. So the issue with that, again, being under-resourcing within the Northern Territory Department of Education, and that the school itself is really kind of jam tight in where they have their teaching spaces, availability of space. The second thing we have been trying to sort out is that the air conditioner itself that's housed in the archive room, I'm pretty sure that it's leaking into the walls, and a lot of the condensation that comes out is actually feeding back into the archive room itself. We have been working trying to bring in some additional philanthropic funding to have a standalone archive built. It's slow business, but we're doing the best we can at this stage. And in the interim, doing all of these other pragmatic approaches that we are hoping is going to save the material before it all absolutely disappears, and rapidly digitising it as quickly as we can.
Yeah, the other issue with that is just the building's infrastructure date and all that kind of stuff. So it's not just the mould, it's also considerations such as asbestos, it's also the disruption to curriculum and schooling. Yeah. It exists in the school.
But it's problematic. I mean, one of the principals from back in the 70s was describing when they shifted the school from the old mission school, which was down closer to the beach, up into the hill. Everyone in the community was saying, no, don't put it up there, because it's part of when the cyclone season, the wet season comes through, the water just streams straight down the hill through the school. However, it was built there. So there are all of these issues that are ongoing. I know there is some new infrastructure they're getting, but it's going to disrupt the school eventually. There are plans to have it moved into another place. We're trying to get something more urgently sorted out for them. However, as I said, you'd all understand it's really slow and problematic bringing funding in for these sorts of things, when ultimately it should be a responsibility of the government, I would suggest.
How much federal closing the gap money gets put into this particular? Zero?
Zero. Look, with the new incoming Northern Territory government, there were announcements that additional funding was going to go into the schools, but all they really did, talking with the co-principals, is restructured the funding, and instead of some of the elements of the school being paid for centrally, they pushed that cost back onto the school, so they ended up actually being worse off, although there's all these announcements, more money going into the bilingual program. So, you know, they're really at risk, these schools and programs themselves. It's significantly politicised and gets caught up in these cycles of politics. Yeah.
It's the hypocrisy of democracy sustained by an ill-informed and incompetent bureaucracy.
Correct.
They don't know how to make policies in these places, and there needs to be a paradigm shift in the minds of policymakers to really invest in what is important on the ground.
Look, I've had meetings with the new incoming government, and look, I'm significantly shocked at how little understanding they have of the importance of bilingual programs and disdain they actually have. Some of the conversations, which I won't repeat here, I walked away horrified.
Yeah. The thing that's missing in this whole thing is that ancient knowledge, people, story, data, song, ceremony has got to be afforded the opportunity to evolve into the modern world. And reality is it's been shunned all this way through, and that's where you have assimilation and that unwritten process at the moment. But let me tell you, the shit's going to get really bad when the future Minister for Efficiency gets in, because she don't give a shit. And reality is it's going to get worse. So
Absolutely.
we need to be innovative. We need to have we've got to make reasonable adjustment to actually put yourself into that environment and understand what do those people need to progress forward and become part of a modern world. Why is it that people in this country, yes, kid, I'm onto it. Let me have my say. Why is it that some people who evolved out of caves themselves come here and in 237 years this year have been given rights to evolve above and beyond? Why aren't we bringing forward one of the world's oldest cultures, people, civilizations? That's where the shift is. And don't talk about acknowledgement at a federal level, because people say, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land in which we gathered, pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. You've heard all the politicians say it. You need to ask them this. Thank you very much for your acknowledgement. Can you now tell me and everyone else in this country how you are authentically doing what you just said? And that's reality. Time for change, people.